today we're going to try and tackle the cam belt with the help of the Haynes Book of Lies. So, as you can see, there is not an awful lot of space down here. So this could be a little bit tricky, but we've got all OEM genuine Volvo parts, so we can only hope it's going to at least go back together very well. How it will come apart, that's another question. Okay, so the first job is to take off the auxiliary belt here, which requires loosening this tensioner here. Now, if you've got a 3/4 inch drive socket or breaker bar as I do, you can just about get it in the end of here. I actually could only get the edge of it in, but it was enough to tweak that and release the tension on the belt and then whip the belt off. I also had to jack the car up and then go into the pulley, which is below this flap here, and pull the belt off the bottom of there. So now we're at that point, we can actually start on the cam belt job. But while I've got this here, this is the auxiliary drive belt I've just removed. It's actually not terrible, but we're going to go ahead and replace this anyway because the car's been sat for, crikey, 3, 4, 5 years now. So this must have been replaced not long before I laid it up. I don't remember exactly when, without going through the service history, but yeah, for peace of mind, you can see it's holding the shape it's been sat in for a few years, so it's definitely worth replacing that while we're at it. Okay, so with the belt out of the way, the next thing is to get to the cam belt itself. So you'll see there's a plastic cover here, and that is attached underneath the fuel lines here. So to get to all of that, the first thing that comes off is this spark plug cover here, which is a T30, I believe, and then they look like 10mm sockets in there, and that looks like possibly a T25 on the back there. So we'll get all of that off first, and then we'll see if we can get this timing cover off and out of the way. Okay, so that went relatively well. Obviously you can see there's a little bit of oil in here, which I actually think is probably a mistake from filling the car at some point in the past, looking at where it's been running off the filler cap. So that all went relatively well. These T30s in the head here that hold the spark plug cover, they're a little bit tight because they're steel bolts and an aluminium head, so careful as you go with those, because I don't believe you can actually get brand new replacements anymore. 2 bolts under there were definitely 10mm. The little bracket that holds the fuel rail on the back was a T25. And then the only other thing I had to remove was there's a bolt down in here which holds this end cover on. That was a 12mm, which is a bit of an odd size socket. That was a 12mm, and then that slots out part of the way. Because the strut brace is on this car, you then had to remove the back piece first, and then there's just enough wiggle room to pull that front cam belt cover off. Now, this looks pretty good actually. This cam belt doesn't look like it's perished, and it looks from some of the state of the equipment down in here that things have been done relatively recently before this car went off the road. However, it has been sat for a number of years, so it's not a risk to take. Because although this looks okay, it might be brittle from sat here with the tension all this time, and you can see a little bit of damage just starting to appear there. It's starting to fray on the outside. So we will stick to the original plan and replace everything we can get to. So I think the next job is probably to get this idler pulley for the aux belt out of the way, and then it's on to start getting the cam belt off. So the next thing we need to remove is the timing belt cover at the bottom of the engine. So in this picture here, you can just about see the pulley has the auxiliary belt on with all the ribs on it, and there's 2 bolts sitting behind that which holds in a plate that wraps under the bottom of the cam belt. Now these are fiddly as hell to get to. They're behind this cover in the wheel arch, and they're a 10mm. Now I've soaked them in WD-40 because I didn't want to risk rounding them. However, I have got some WD-40 on this lower pulley. Ideally, you don't want any WD-40 on a belt pulley, so I'm going to have to degrease that at some point in the future before the belt goes back on. But hopefully these will come off nice and easily. So that is the cam belt lower guard. You can see the 2 bolts that go in from the side that I pointed out in the previous section. They are a little bit fiddly, and they're really rather long actually. And they've got this odd shank on them before the thread. which is bizarre. They've also got thread locker on them as well. So I'll give those a clean up before they go back on. But as that's now off, we are on to setting the timing. So those of you that have done a cam belt change on an 850 before will have noted a small mistake I've made. So I took this plastic piece off that sits on top of the engine just next to the spark plug cover. Now that has actually got a little notch here and a little notch here. I wanted it out of the way so I can see what I'm working with a little bit better and inspect the belt. However, that now has to go back on because those two notches allow me to line up the cams before I take the belt off. So I'm just going to pop that back on and then line the belts up. Okay, so here we are. We have got the timing mark cover plate, whatever you want to call it, back onto the rocker cover, and I have done my best to align the markings. I'll add some photos in where it's a bit clearer, and I've peered down into the abyss here indefinitely, and I think I've got those lined up as best I can tell. The marks are almost indistinguishable on that bottom pulley, but there is a very faint mark right in the root of the tooth, between the two teeth, that aligned to a projection sticking out of, I think it's the oil pump housing down there. So if I can get that on photo, I will add it into the video. So I'm fairly convinced now I'm lined up here. I'm lined up on the top with these two marks that stick out of here, and the marks on there. It's a bit of a funny angle with the camera, so it doesn't quite look aligned on this side. So now we're on to the next stage, which is starting to loosen up the tensioner and actually getting the belt off without moving these in any way, shape or form. So that could be interesting. So by handy coincidence, I have a spare engine. So this is really helpful to get some context on what it is we're doing. So you can see the timing belt pulleys up here with the little notches for your timing marks. And you can see the belt comes down, it comes around a water pump, which has clearly been recently replaced on this engine. Then around this pulley here, which is attached to the tensioner. Now this is the next item we've got to take off. So you can see the two bolts here we're going to have to access. They are going to be tricky because there's a chassis rail just here. The belt then disappears off behind this auxiliary belt pulley, and then it comes back up here around an idler here behind this auxiliary belt tensioner that we've just removed, and then back up and around the top. So it's a fairly simple system, but access is definitely going to be a pain. So here goes. So that is the tensioner out. Things to note, so these are both 12mm heads on here. You slacken and remove the top one first, which allows it to pivot on that lower one. That will gently release the tension on the belt, which will allow you to release and remove this one. You'll need to loosen that off first to allow this to move, and it should move anti-clockwise from the position it is in, holding the tensioner. So then you can take the lower bolt out and off it comes. Also to note, the top one is easiest accessed from the top of the bonnet. This one here is accessed through the wheel arch with a little flap that lifts up. But you'll have to note the clearance to the auxiliary pulley, which sits just here, is very, very tight. So you need a socket with quite a thin wall to it. So I actually ended up using a combination of a 1/4 inch drive and a 3/8 drive because it's very thin walled. Obviously you have to be careful the amount of torque you put on these, you don't split them. But what it does mean is you can't use an impact socket like this that has a very thick wall because you won't get it onto the bolt with that pulley in the way. So now it's on to getting the belt off and then getting the actual tensioner pulley itself off. One last thing before we go though, you will notice there's a tiny little pinhole here and a tiny little pinhole here. Those will come in very important when it comes to refitting, well, not this one, but the new one that's going to replace it. Interestingly, this one doesn't actually look too bad. So with the tensioner successfully removed, the next thing is to take the belt off. Now clearly you can see this part I've put back on does cover over the belt, so that's got to come back off again. So two 10mm on the back where the fuel lines come, and that will allow us to wiggle the belt off the pulleys and take it down off the bottom pulley, which I'm told is an absolute pain because it's tucked down there behind the auxiliary belt pulley. That's going to be fun. So that is it, the belt is out. The Haynes Book of Lies says there is minimal clearance to get the belt off at the crankshaft end. That's an understatement. So you've got to turn this through 90 degrees and squeeze it past the crank position sensor to get it past the auxiliary belt pulley, which is the bigger pulley in front of the cam belt drive. That is incredibly difficult. Once you figure out how you've got to do it, it does pop out fairly easily, but you've got to manipulate the belt to a really awkward position in a very specific spot to be able to pull it out in one piece. The temptation, of course, is to cut the belt and pull it out. As you're pulling it out, you run the risk of catching one of the teeth and moving one of the gears, but also you don't learn how to get the belt back in for doing the new belt when that's got to go back on. So all a learning curve, but fiddly as hell. So, little thing to note when taking out the idler pulley, which is this little fella here, is it uses a T-5 socket. So that's this fella here. But unfortunately, there is insufficient clearance, let me get that to focus, with the chassis rail. I was able to get the T-45 in at an angle and slot it home, but I realised as soon as I started to undo it, I'd end up with the ratchet pushed hard against the chassis rail and I wouldn't be able to extract it. So I was able to crack the T-45 off in that method, pull the ratchet back out, and I've had to resort to using a pair of mole grips on a T-45 to get something that's actually shallow enough to go in. So be aware of that when you start this job. You need some sort of very shallow T-45 socket to get into that tensioner. Okay, well, once you have pulled the tensioner, it's dead easy to pull the idler. It's just two 12mm bolts and it drops away. In the case of both of these, they're actually in pretty fine fettle, but we've got them out, so we'll replace them anyway. Okay, so next step is to take the water pump out. So this is the new water pump. Handily, Volvo supply you with a new set of bolts for this, which already have the hydraulic sealing compound on the thread already, which is something it tells you to go to the dealer for in the Haynes manual, but they're pre-impregnated on the threads of the bolts, so that's dead handy. So we're going to put the new gasket on here, fit it onto the two dowels, which you can see the holes for here and here, and then bolt it all up. So there are 7 10mm bolts around the outside of it, and then it's sitting on two dowels in the engine, so it does take a bit of a wiggle to get that off. As with all these jobs, you have to be prepared to be a contortionist, mainly because this piece of, I don't know what it's, plastic here, which holds on the outer cam cover, gets right in the way of any access you choose to try and attack it with. So it's fiddly, but take your time. Make sure that you clean off any remnants of the gasket on that surface. So I've been round with my contortionist hands, slowly cleaning away with a Stanley knife blade as carefully as possible, trying very carefully not to take any nicks out with the blade, which is easy to do. So now it's clean, we're going to put on the new water pump and we can actually start the reassembly. Woo! So, as you can see, the new water pump is in, all tightened up, those 10mm bolts to 20 Newton meters. So these are my new pulleys. These come with the standard cam belt kit for a Volvo 850 T5, T5R, etc. So you've got the idler pulley and you've got the tensioner pulley. Interestingly, the tensioner pulley comes with a captive Torx key to hold that in. The idler, however, does not come with new bolts, so I'm going to have to fish bolts from the pile down here out. Luckily I've labelled everything up and put it all in bags so I know which ones go where. And if you're wondering what that is, well, I told you you need to be a contortionist, and I wasn't a very good contortionist, and I broke my nail on the edge of that when I was trying to tighten up the water pump. So the last piece in the puzzle before the belt goes back on is the tensioner. So this is the one that came out of the car. You can see the tensioner has extended out of the end here. It's basically a big plunger. This is the new one, and you see it has a pin in it. Now, if you're intending on reusing this, there is a trick to reloading this plunger and holding it using that hole there, which I will cut away to and show you now. Okay, so as I mentioned while I was working on the car, if you are to reuse this belt tensioner, you need to preload it before you put it back in the car, because you won't be able to get the tensioner pulley in the right spot to put the belt on. So I'm going to show you what the method in the Haynes Book of Lies is, with a slight modification to where I think it's easier. So here goes. The method in the book suggests you put the tensioner into a vise. However, my bench vise is only a 4-inch vise, so a couple of inches short. Anyway, I found a G-clamp on the shelf which is big enough to compress this, so I'm going to very carefully compress this with the G-clamp, and I've set another camera up to hopefully time-lapse this if it doesn't go ping across the workshop. So here we are, we have compressed the tensioner piston, and what I've done, I've inserted an Allen key to lock this off. So at the moment it's loose because the tension is still on. Now the Haynes Book of Lies suggests using a 2mm twist bit drill, which actually I don't have, but I realised that that might be quite difficult to extract once in the car, whereas I thought the Allen key, having the turn on the head there, might make it easier to pull out. I tried using a 2mm Allen key, but it's just a little bit tight in the slot, so the 1.5mm will have to do. The alternative to that is if you happen to have the pin. So this is the original pin that comes with it, which obviously came out of the new one I've just fitted, and that should go in there with a bit of luck. Yes, it goes in. I don't know if it's gone all the way through the side. No, it's not. It's not perfectly lined up inside. There we go. That's now through. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to put the Allen key back in just to try it, see whether my method works, and then we'll remove the tension and see what happens. So, success. The Allen key method does work. However, you'll note there is quite a bend in that Allen key, so I'm not quite sure how secure that will be and how good it is for the Allen key, but I think it's a useful thing to know that if you need to recompress the tensioner piston, an Allen key will do the job, and it gives you the leverage to be able to pull it out. For safekeeping, I'm now going to retension this and take the tension off, because it feels like this might be slightly dangerous. But hopefully that's useful for you. Okay, so once you have this plunger pushed back in with your appropriate pin or otherwise in it, you can then refit it. As with the idler, this doesn't come with a new set of bolts, so we're going to reuse the ones we had that came out of the car. So lower one goes in first, and then that allows you to then swing it into position and pop the top one in. So here goes. Okay, we have success. We have a tensioner piston down here, which is now bolted in. It's only finger tight to allow a bit of movement until such time as the belt is in. We still have the grenade pin in, which we keep in until the belt goes on, because that will release the tensioner and will push this too far over for us to get the belt on. Handy little tip is to use a bungee cord like this. Handy if you've got a strut brace to hook it onto, and that pulls the tensioner pulley up out of the way, so you've got space to get this plunger in. However, you will find that won't move into the right place if you're an idiot like me and you put the idler in upside down. So the idler has no locating feature on the block of the engine, so you can actually bolt it in either way. Which means if you bolt it in the way I did first time, it fouls with the tensioner pulley. And as it's just a little triangular plate with 2 bolts on, you can take it out, flip it round. It should be in this highest location here, closest to the edge of the cam belt cover, rather than down over here, which is where it was when that plate was the other way around. So with all that in, it's time to put the belt back on. However, I have made a boo. So there's a little white mark on there, as there is a little white mark there, and if you get to the right location, those line up. It's a bit difficult to get it in the right spot with the camera. You'll notice this one does not line up. because Numbnuts here has managed to knock this pulley while doing the work. So I'm going to have to carefully reset that to where it should be, and check this one hasn't moved, and check the main pulley down there hasn't moved before putting the belt on properly and releasing the tensioner. So the next job is to get the belt on, so I can get the belt on, put this plate back on here and check it all lines up first. So that's the next job. Let's crack on. Okay, here is the lovely new belt. Now, one thing I should probably point out is the kit comes with this little clip which goes around the top of the tensioner. Now, you are to add this if fitted. My car was not fitted with one, so I don't intend to refit it. If anybody knows what the purpose of that is, then do leave a note in the comment below. It seems that it doesn't interact with the actual tensioning system whatsoever, so maybe it's a bit of a guide. But as I say, my vehicle didn't have it fitted, and it only says to refit if fitted. So, on to weaving this belt past the crank sensor. Wish me luck. So, the belt is on after a god-awful struggle. Such a big struggle that the neighbours thought I might be trapped underneath the car. So, I've put this plate back on just to check the timing. And this is why it's incredibly important. So, you can see the timing mark here, which is actually relatively well aligned to the mark here. However, my timing mark here is not. It's just there. Come on, camera, spin round. My timing mark is there, my notch is here. So that is a tooth out. So this is going to have to come back off, and we're going to have to try again. The problem is this is right on the fulcrum of the cam, so it does like to jump a good few degrees each way as you're lining it up, which appears to be the problem, which is why these timing marks are so vitally important. So it should be around there, not there. So here we go again. So as you can see, I've now got the belt back on, and we have a nice alignment here. We have a nice alignment here. The trick was making sure to keep tension on this right hand side of the belt from the bottom pulley up, round over the top of here, and the pulleys needed a tiny little amount of change left and right. And when you're trying to turn them by hand, they do jump an awful lot. So I found a top little tip. If you use a pry bar across those bolts very, very gently, it will allow you to adjust just a fraction of a degree, which is enough to seat the belt into the teeth while carrying the tension over. Same again on that side, and away you go. And then it's just a case of wrapping it round and over the tensioner down there. And actually, once I got the right tension in here and the two pulleys in the right position, the belt slotted on relatively easily. So the final piece of the puzzle is to remove the grenade pin, which will set off the tensioner and put the belts all into tension. So here goes. Right, here goes. That should be the belt tension. Okay, so that is us done for today. That was a fairly mammoth effort, but the cam belt has changed. Everything is back together. You'll notice the tensioner for the auxiliary belt is back on, but no auxiliary belt, so I need to order a new belt, possibly a new tensioner. I don't know how good that tensioner is, and the pulley looks pretty ropey. So for the sake of fixing it, I might as well replace those as well. So these are just done sort of finger tight, and we'll do that next time.